Hello, my name is Patricia, and in this video I'm going to be sharing two very personal rejection stories. One about my experience switching from an Asian education system to an American education system, and another one about my experience trying to re-enter the Asian education system. I thought it would be pretty interesting for people who have been in either education system to hear what it's like to switch into a very different education system. So let's go ahead and get started. The first story took place 10 years ago when I was an 8th grader studying at an international school in Taiwan and trying to apply to private boarding school in America. The application process was actually pretty similar to college application in the US. It requires your school transcript, TOEFL score, which is a English standardized exam for international students, 2 recommendation letters, some short essays, an SSAT score, which is basically an easier version of the SAT exam, and finally an interview. At that time, my family had no experience with the whole application process. With the help of the agency, I applied to 6 private boarding schools in America. The application cycle was also pretty similar to college application cycle. I sent in all my applications around December, and I waited for the results to come out. By early March, decision letters started to come in. I opened the letters one by one, only to find out that they were all rejection letters. I got rejected from all 6 schools I applied to. I can't really describe how I felt at that time, but it was really ego-crushing. Thinking back about it, it was still a hard time. The agency was pretty shocked too, because I had straight A's and I had pretty decent exam scores. What could have gone wrong? Turns out it was the interview. I was very bad at doing interviews. Growing up in Taiwanese education system, I was very used to giving standardized answers. So I remember my agency would practice interviews with me. For instance, one of the questions would be, what can you bring to the school? And the agency would suggest my response being something like, I can contribute to the cultural diversity. During interviews, I always gave these very standardized answers. I didn't really think much about it. I was pretty plain and I never really reflect on who I really am as a person. I was also very shy and reserved at the time. I didn't know how to express myself. After that rejection, I started to think deeply about who I really am, what are my hobbies, what are my personalities really like, and practice expressing myself. Luckily, there were still some schools open on rolling basis, so I applied to 3 other schools, and this time around, I really tried my best at the interviews. I ended up getting into all 3 schools this time. I was still really shocked that interviews were the game changers. It was still a very slow process for me to learn to develop my own opinions and express them. I remember in high school during literature classes, my teachers would ask us to give our own interpretation of the text we're reading. And I always struggled with those types of questions because in the past, I've always been given an interpretation. I never really had to come up with my own. Even when I started developing my own views and opinions, I would have trouble voicing myself during class, so I was always very quiet during class. It took me a really long time to be able to join in class discussion and stuff. And I remember some of my high school friends were actually pretty surprised that I can speak fluently because they thought that I was quiet because I had a language barrier, when in fact that I am just not used to expressing myself. Obviously, over the years, I've improved a lot on that, and now I even started my own YouTube channel. But looking back, I don't think I really contributed to the so-called cultural diversity to my high school because I didn't really talk about my own culture like what I did in my previous videos. So that was my experience trying to enter the American education system from an Asian education system. Next, I'm gonna talk about my recent experience trying to re-enter back into the Asian education system. So last year I graduated from college in the US and I moved back to Taiwan. This June I took an entrance exam for a med school program here and I didn't get in. The thing is, in Taiwan, it's usually not the case that you apply and get accepted into a school. It's more like you get tested into a school. So the program eliminates most candidates based on a cutoff score. They don't really look at extracurriculars, transcript, recommendation letters. Most candidates were expert test takers because entrance into Taiwanese high school and college are usually determined by a nationwide standardized exam. It's also very normal for high schoolers to attend what's called a cram school after school. So they're basically studying all day because at the end of the day, it's test score that determines whether you get into a good school. I can totally make another video on the whole cram school culture, and I know that would sound very insane to many Americans. And in fact, whenever I talk to some Taiwanese friends, they're always very surprised that I never had to memorize the first 30 elements on the periodic table, never had to memorize square root of 2, 3, 5, 7, and natural logs of those numbers. And I always had a calculator with me during exams, and usually a formula sheet. Basically, I was spoiled by the American education system. This exam, especially the physics and chemistry section, really requires test-taking skills. The problems themselves aren't that hard. They're like problems from standard physics and chemistry textbooks, except that you can't use a calculator. So I had to get really good at hand calculation. And also, I only get around 1 minute for each question, so I really had to develop a problem-solving reflex. This is the norm for Taiwanese education, and this is the fate that I've been avoiding all these years. So over a year of studying harder than I've ever been, this year I really became a lot better at test-taking, problem-solving, and memorizing in general. And I actually made it pretty close to the cutoff score, so I've decided to try again next year. And another reason for me to start a YouTube channel is that studying for an exam was pretty lonely, and I often got into this cycle of self-doubt and anxiety. It was honestly very excruciating. I actually once asked my Taiwanese friend how could they remain sane under this education for years, and then my friend actually gave me a funny response. She thinks that everyone's a little insane on the inside. So I thought that YouTube could be an outlet for me to share how I feel and document my progress and stuff. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. I really appreciate it. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section.